People call me notorious. So I'm just going to ramble a little bit about landscapes in this area and where it came from and who and what has been here. I'm active right now trying to establish a fossil park in Columbus, and of course I can't pass up an opportunity to talk a little bit about fossils. The earliest fossils you're going to find around here are really between Russellville and Florence, and on some of the road cuts there's sediments that is about 250 million years old, and you find trilobites and all kinds of fun stuff in them. And that's enough about that up there. What's really interesting is the Luxpalala Creek. Now, I think the Lux is a little bit south of you, but Yellow Creek, which is one of its branches, if I'm not mistaken, goes through or real close to Vernon. And I guess it was about 3 years ago, I'm online looking something up and find out that BBC had just done a special report on a new dinosaur found in the Luxpalala Creek. And I thought, what? And then I looked at it, it said, in Lowndes County, Mississippi. And then I Googled to see what all was going on and found out the Smithsonian had published an article on this new dinosaur. And then I found out there'd been a special on the Discovery Channel. I went, okay, this is interesting. So I looked to see where the information came from, and ended up being a friend of mine who was a paleontologist, and I called him and he said, you remember some of those bones you found about 10 years ago? I said, yeah. He said, well, we've identified a small bone you have, and somebody else brought in some bones, and then a paleontologist in Mongolia recognized him and said there's a similar creature in Mongolia. And that turned out to open up the Luxpalala now is considered one of the 5 most significant dinosaur fossil locations east of the Mississippi River. What I found, a bitty bone right here. And I had noticed something funny about it. There's no marrow. It's slick like a bird's bone. And what I was told is, well, that's either going to be a Tyrannosaurus or this new ostrich mimic dinosaur that's been found that made the news. And I got a lecture on people don't realize that dinosaurs took on a lot of characteristics of birds long before we thought they did. And what was found was a dinosaur that was 12 to 15 feet tall and had feathers. And they were washing out of the bank along the Luxpalala. This is half of the foot bone. On my foot, that bone's about this long. This is a cast of a toe bone. If you can picture how big somebody's toe is, if this is the bone off of that toe. These are cast. The original specimens are still being examined. Actually, right now, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science. And one other thing that came out of this, claw. And I said, like a raptor, like Velociraptor in Jurassic Park, and they laughed. And they said, well, yeah, it's a distant cousin. And then said, but you know that Velociraptor in Jurassic Park? I said, yeah, I thought it was a real creature. They said it was, but it's only about that tall. And then pulled out a tooth I'd found that was only about this big, and they said, that's a raptor tooth. I went, oh. So Hollywood had taken a lot of fossils are coming out of the Luxembourg Island now. And so that's where we're putting the fossil park. There's a park in Columbus now, Probst Park. And that's where they were coming from, most of them in that area. So we're going to have a park there where the public can go and collect fossils. And we're looking at partnering with the Geology Department at Mississippi State, Meteorology and Geography, and having an Earth Sciences Learning Laboratory. So it will be interesting when it's done. And we've finally got it named, and it's going to be named the John M. Jack K. Fossil Park. I've got to share you one story about him because fascinating individual. He was an Army Air Corps pilot in World War II. He became a geologist. He actually discovered the fossils in the Luxembourg Island and was published internationally on his work. In talking with his son, I found out a story I'd never heard before. I knew he had flown for the Army in the South Pacific in World War II, but he flew off of Henderson Field at Guadalcanal while the Japanese were still attacking it. On one occasion, he had landed, heard sirens, jumped out of his plane and started running, and as he was running away, a Japanese bomb hit his plane and blew it up. What amazed me, he flew 287 combat missions. That is a phenomenal number of combat missions. And most of them were against the main Japanese naval base at Rabaul. And I've seen documentaries on it talking about the large number of American aircraft that were shot down attacking the Japanese fleet. But that leads up to the real story here. He said on his first mission, they had all the pilots in the radio room talking to him, and they said, most important thing to know is if you're shot down and you're going down, whatever you do, do not bail out over the jungle. Try to make it to the ocean. And somebody said, is it because the Japanese are so bad and their treatment so bad on American POWs? And the colonel said, no, it's because the jungle is full of cannibals and they'll eat you. And he said, it wasn't long after that, he was flying on a mission. He was fighter bomber, had dive bombed on a Japanese destroyer, and had circled back to strafe the Japanese base on his way out. And as he came over the trees, just clipping treetops, treetop level, he saw all these sticks in the air around him, and he thought, what in the world? And then he realized it was the natives in this jungle throwing spears at his plane, trying to bring his plane down with spears. So we felt like, okay, not only was he a geologist who found this, but somebody we needed to name the park after, so we did.
Is that Carolyn's?
Flew in World War I, and he was a fighter pilot. He flew a French Spad. It was painted light blue with red and white polka dots. He flew, he was a wingman for Eddie Rickenbacker, and Rickenbacker had a flying circus and told his pilots they could paint their airplanes any way they wanted to. And Captain Coy did. He painted it light blue with red and white polka dots. A lot of goes through the really early stuff here. Where Vernon is, this was the beach basically 80 million years ago. Columbus basically was underneath a shallow ocean that extended all the way to Dallas and went right through the middle of North America. There was a volcano underneath Jackson, Mississippi. You drill down a couple of thousand feet in Jackson and you hit boiling water still. Where we are would have been the beach. Where the park is in Columbus was right behind, it was an estuary right behind a barrier island. So you get both marine fossils and terrestrial fossils. You find Triceratops, you find Tyrannosaurus, you find this really weird feathered dinosaur, you find Hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs. Every dinosaur kid ever dreams about, so we think it will be a popular place. The most interesting fossil, other than this crazy creature, is somebody found not far from there the leg bone of a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur, and it had been chewed in half and broken off, and it was a row of 7 broken shark's teeth. So apparently this dinosaur had gotten in a fight in shallow water with a shark and lost. So a lot of interesting things, and all that was in this area. The Native Americans moved into this area probably 12 to 15,000 years ago. And they, by historic, the top 2 are Creek Indians, and the bottom 2 are Choctaw. I know their names. This is Mashula Tubby and Peter Pitchland. And so, basically, for the most part, European costumes. The other thing, Native American sites, in the historic ones, I was able to identify the Indian sites from the white settler sites, because the Indians were eating off the nice English china. This was a popular pattern on Choctaw Indian house sites. It's Lafayette Landing at Castle Guard, New York. It was made around 1825, 1826. And I found an account of Mashula Tubby and Pushmataha, who were 2 Choctaw chiefs, met and had an afternoon sit down with Lafayette when he visited America, and they were in Washington at the time, 40. I like to tell people about books that are out there. Charles Hudson wrote this, and he wrote it about 1995, but it's still the best book that's out there on the Desoto expedition. And one of the things that he did is he tried to plot out DeSoto's route. He then traveled it and tried to explore to see what it was like. Well, his wife, Joyce, wrote this, Looking for DeSoto. And she tells about having to stop at DeSoto Caverns just because he wanted to see caverns that were named after DeSoto. And if they were traveling and saw a DeSoto motel, they had to stay at the DeSoto motel. And for wives who have husbands who get off on weird stuff, you will love this. It's a lighthearted, fun account, but it actually shows you a lot about how all that was researched. In the last few years, Ashley Dumas at University of West Alabama has probably discovered the Movilla site. That was, people have been looking for that for years. It's near Demopolis. And on the north side of Starkville, Brad Lee, who's tribal archaeologist for the Chickasaw Nation, has found sites with Spanish artifacts on them that are probably going to be Chickasaw, that was the ancestral home of the Chickasaw. One of the things, dabbling in history, and I say dabbling, I'm actually a recovering lawyer by profession. History's a lot more interesting. The story goes on DeSoto that the Chickasaw, he'd gotten along fairly good with the Chickasaws, who were right across the Tombigbee River when he came out of Alabama, until he was getting ready to move on and said he wanted 200 Chickasaws to be their bearers and carry all their stuff. basically be their slaves. Chickasaws did not like that, and according to history books and the accounts, 5 people with DeSoto kept journals that have either complete or in part have survived. Talk about how the Indians attacked them at night and had could have wiped them out, but the corral where all the horses were caught fire and the horses stampeded out, and the Chickasaws thought that that was a Spanish trap and the Spanish cavalry was coming out, and they ran away. Well, working with the Chickasaws, they have a different version of that. Their version is that it was Chickasaw tradition. If they allowed somebody to come into their land, they would be friendly with them unless those people stepped across the line. And then they would have just a sudden, hard assault on those people, and before the people could react and kill any Chickasaws, they would pull back and basically send word, next time we'll wipe you out. And they say that's what happened with DeSoto. They hit DeSoto's men, set his camp on fire, turned the horses loose. DeSoto had pigs with them. They killed a bunch of the pigs, and then they pulled back. The Spanish had like 16 men killed and 30 or 40 wounded. The Chickasaws had 1 man killed, and that was their only casualty. So it really fits the description the Chickasaws gave of what happened. The thing, though, that we need to really celebrate, the only thing about DeSoto we can celebrate, we can commemorate his coming through here, but he's not a person to celebrate, but he's a person to commemorate. He was driving a herd of about 300 hogs with him. So do you know what he did here? He had the first pork barbecue in Alabama and the first pork barbecue in Mississippi. And that's something we really do need to commemorate. A friend of mine who passed away a few years ago, who was a really neat guy, some of you might have known him, Doug Jones. He was Dean of Arts and Sciences at Alabama and head of the Alabama Museum System. And he was heavy into DeSoto too, and every year we'd have a DeSoto barbecue in Columbus and eat some good meat, and we did it right. Before we'd sit down and eat, local Catholic priest came and held up a pork rib and blessed the pork rib, and then we ate, as I've ever heard. Many years ago, the Peabody Museum from Yale had contacted him, and they wanted to come down to Moundville and go through the Alabama collection to see if Alabama had misidentified any artifacts. I think Doug rolled his eyes and said, sure, we'd be glad to have you here. And they came down. And they went through the collection at Moundville and said, well, y'all identified everything correctly. This is good, this is good. And Doug said, well, our prized DeSoto artifact is in the vault at Smith Hall on campus. You know, if y'all would like to see that, I would be glad to show it to you. And of course they said, yes, definitely, we'd like to see that. And they met at Smith Hall the next day on the Alabama campus, which is the Museum of Natural History, and went back in the vault, and went in the vault, and they had said, can we film it or photograph it? And Doug said, I'd be happy if you would. So they had hired a video crew to come in and video this prize artifact. And they went in the vault. And it was like safety deposit boxes in there. And they went to one and they had a table set up. And Doug had his key, office manager had hers, and they turned the key, pulled out the safety deposit box, put it on the table. The Peabody Museum people set up lights around it and set up a camera to film it. Doug opened it, and it was covered in purple velvet. And he pulled the velvet back, and there it was. A mint condition 1951 Desoto hubcap. And he said, "Ain't she a beauty?" Miss Harris is working in the museum now, and I'm sitting next to her at Chickasaw Luncheon in Tupelo. Not long, she had only been working in Alabama a couple of weeks. I asked her if I said, "Did you ever meet Doug?" And she said, "No." I said, "Did you ever hear about the Peabody Museum?" And she just started laughing. And I said, "Oh, okay, you have." She said, "Yeah." She said that her first week on the job, she was going through the artifacts that were in the vault. And here was a Desoto hubcap. And she asked somebody, "What is this doing in the vault?" And they told me the story of Doug Jones and the Peabody Museum and said, "This is one of our prized possessions now." So it's still there. My wife rolled her eyes. I had to buy me a Desoto hubcap just like it and hang it on my wall. It can be fun. So now what they're doing with the material that Ashley found and that Brad had found near Starkville, the Florida Museum of Natural History has, I think they're using X-ray fluorescence, one of the high-tech things that they use. And they're able to look at the trace elements that make up the iron and the way it's smelted. And they can pinpoint within 50 or 75 years when this piece of rusted iron was made and where it came from. And so they're checking the metal out, and they hadn't gotten a report back yet to see if they can pinpoint. DeSoto had good records on where he purchased weapons and where they came from, and be able to identify whether these pieces of rusted iron came from DeSoto or came from another Spaniard. So there is a little bit of Indian history. Again, archaeology can be fun. I took my children one time, the Chickasaws in the University of Florida were excavating a site up near Amory, and took the kids up there, and they were just 7 and 9 years old. And I was looking at something and walked over, and they were excavating, they were digging. And here's one of the archaeologists against a tree asleep next to him. And I said, "Y'all are letting them do that?" And they said, "Oh, that's disturbed soil, so the depth of strata is not that important, and we just told them to dig it all out and put it in a bucket for us, so I get to take a nap." As we move forward a little bit further, come to the Creek Indian War period. The Creek Indian War was a phase of the War of 1812. And one of my favorite stories is, y'all know Davy Crockett was in this area. And actually, when he fought the Indians, it was around Tuscaloosa. Well, he wrote an autobiography. And one of the things that didn't make Walt Disney's Davy Crockett movie, he came back through this area in October of 1814. He was with Colonel Gilbert Russell, and Russell actually at that time commanded the 3rd Regiment, which is known today as the Old Guard at Arlington Cemetery. And they were fighting here during the War of 1812. Crockett was supposed to be a scout with them. And it's fascinating. He mentioned that he missed the rendezvous with the troops he was supposed to be scouting in front of. And then I came across in the National Archives a letter from General Coffee, who was in command, overall command of that brigade that was coming through. And he said they had stopped for supplies at John Pitchland's house, which is Plymouth Bluff across the river from Columbus, and said our scouts had missed our rendezvous, and we were told that they were about a week behind us looking for us, and we decided that we could not wait, and we proceeded south. I thought, okay, Davy Crockett got lost in this area, but it didn't make the movie. And Crockett was an interesting individual. He was very much opposed to the removal of Native American people. He had fought the Indians, but he had a lot of respect for them. And at the same time, I found records that the people in Columbus were opposed to the removal of the Choctaw and Chickasaw. They said they were an honorable people who always paid their debts, and they are some of our best customers, and we don't want to lose them. So, again, history is interesting when you dig down into it. At that football cheer, 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar.
Yeah.
You know where it came from? Counting Spanish money. That's 2 bits. Spanish had we would call a silver dollar. The silver dollar is based on it, called an 8 real coin. And it could be either minted into, broken down into 1 bit that was 12.5 cents, or 2 bits was a quarter. And 4 bits would be 50 cents. 8 bits was a dollar. So 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar. You're counting Spanish money. It was legal tender in the U.S. until 1859, and people in the South did not trust American money. And many of the contracts I see from the 1820s, 30s, and 40s specify payment in Spanish silver. And I always heard that people would punch holes in them and wear them like a necklace, and it's jewelry when you find that. Then I came across the account of somebody who was traveling, and he mentioned to take your money, punch a hole in it, and pin it inside the lining of your jacket so it can't be seen. And that way, if you're robbed, they won't know where to get your money. And so, again, an old tradition, and because people knew that it was solid silver, you've seen antique coin silver, that meant that it was made out of either melted or pounded flat Spanish coins. And they would make silver goblets, spoon, serving pieces out of it, and that when it says coin silver, that meant it's made from Spanish money. Jumping way forward just briefly, there was a program on TV, maybe 2 years ago, about looking for the lost Confederate silver. Apparently when Richmond fell, there was hundreds of thousands of Mexican silver dollars put on wagons and carried down towards Georgia, and it disappeared. So this whole TV program was about finding it. Well, it wasn't lost. This is one of them. That's a Mexican silver dollar. My great uncle gave it to me when I was about 10 years old, and he had always carried it in his pocket so the dates weren't off. But he said one of his neighbors had given it to him and told him it's a very important good luck piece, and whatever you do, don't lose it, but carry it with you.
These coins are pure silver?
Yeah, that is.
Well, I don't have it.
Or it's like 98%. It's almost pure. It's as pure as anything you would find.
Do you know whose picture is on that
It's
The
one of the
image?
Spanish kings. That one is probably Carlos
It
IV.
looks just like our George Washington on our quarter.
Well, that's the style of clothes they wore in the 1700s. So it would look like that. And although I doubt George Washington threw a silver dollar away when that supposedly happened, it would have been a Spanish 8 real. And if you made change and cut one in half or in pie-shaped wedges, it's called a piece of 8. Y'all ever heard that term? What pirates were looking for were these silver coins. And so that is a real piece of 8. But back to the Mexican silver dollar. What my great uncle had been told was that had been given to him at the end of the Civil War. Well, in the Lee Home Museum in Columbus, there's one in uncirculated condition with a note attached from General Stephen D. Lee. And he wrote that at the end of the war, his troops had not been paid in anything but worthless paper money in a year, and these wagons loaded with Confederate silver coins came through their camp and asked for protection. And Lee and the other generals ordered that all the money be seized and divided among the troops, and said it was enough for every soldier to get one, and half the soldiers could get a second one, and they drew lots for the second one, and the officers got two, and he said that he only took one because the men needed it more than he did, and that was what happened to those wagons of missing silver they made a TV show about looking for. It'd been divided up among Confederate troops in April of 1865. Again, stories you find in history. There's a wonderful Civil War period story out of West Point, Mississippi. There's a skirmish force sent out to scout the Union troops. Well, a Union soldier had been sent out to scout the Confederate troops, and they both wound up on either side of a hedge along the fence, and raised up at the same time, looking across a hedge, and said they were looking eyeball to eyeball, and didn't know what to do. And the Yankee stuck out his hand and said, "I'm so-and-so, pleased to meet you." And so the Confederate shook out his hand and said, "Well, I'm so-and-so, I'm pleased to meet you too." And they started talking, and one of them said to the other one, "You know, we don't have any personal animosity. We don't need to fight. We'll let other people do that." And he said, "That sounds good to me." And after a little while, they decided they would each return to their camp and report they'd seen scattered soldiers, but that was all they saw was scattered soldiers, and they were able to slip away without getting caught. But the Union soldier made the comment, "This prairie land, some of the prettiest land I've ever seen. I think when this war is over, I want to come down here and be a farmer. I'm going to move down here." Well, about 2 years after the war ended, the Confederate soldier went to First Christian Church, and they had a new member they introduced. It was the Yankee he had met. And he had kept what he said, moved down, he had bought farmland and was farming down here. Well, the Confederate son and the Yankee's daughter ended up getting married. And so, again, a fun story. History's not all bad. Probably one of the strangest stories I've come across. Whenever you go to Columbus, about halfway from the state line to Columbus, you cross a creek called Black Creek. A ghost story was written about that creek in 1850-51, and it ended up being a book that was a bestseller across the country. And it told how that when the military road was being built, that Andrew Jackson had ordered some men to cross the flooded creek, and 2 men drowned. And now if you go across that creek on a dark night and you hear strange noises, sometimes you'll see two black horses head high at what would have been flood level, riding across and down the creek, snorting flames with two headless riders with swords waving in the air, crossing the creek. And there's another story about somebody drowning in the creek, and that goes telling it. Then there was a third story in the book about a horrible murder that took place at the creek bank there, and that individual haunted it, and that if it's dark and stormy, you'd better not go there at all, because all three ghosts are going to get you. Well, I got curious and dug into some old newspapers, and my friend Carolyn Coy, who helps me sometimes, dug into some, and lo and behold, Andrew Jackson, we knew, never came down Military Road. It was built mostly by a regiment of artillery and 2 regiments of infantry. But 2 of the U.S. soldiers died at a camp on Howard Creek, which is the first creek before you get to Black Creek, and were buried on the side of the road there. I thought, they could well have drowned, and this would be the basis of that first ghost story. And then came across an account in 1839 Columbus paper that a man by the name of White had come to Columbus to sell a bunch of products he had, and had sold it and was riding back. He was from Russellville, riding back to Russellville, and got waylaid on the side of the creek, and somebody had ridden up next to him and shot him twice in the back of the head. And the account went on that word got out there'd been a murder and all his money stolen. And if you can believe this, there was a meeting of the people of Columbus in a bar called Bell's Tavern. And after just 1 or 2 drinks, somebody put up money as a reward, and they ended up having a $1,200 reward for the capture of whoever killed the person. This is at a time when a house would sell for $600. And suddenly, everybody in the place said, I'll go, and they sent out 2 posses. And they did not catch the bandit, but they were able to get him identified. And it was a man by the name of McCaleb, who was from Walker County outside of Russellville, had known this individual was going to Columbus to sell stuff, and had robbed him and fled to Texas. So I thought, yeah, and then found where a young man had drowned there under mysterious circumstances about the same time, and I thought, okay, all 3 of these stories have a real kind of a basis that the story came out of. And it was fascinating to see these accounts that were all written in the late 1830s, and then read the ghost story and see the overlap that took place with that. The Gideon Linscomb moved from Georgia to Tuscaloosa in 1816. He moved from Tuscaloosa to Columbus in 1818. His wife was almost killed by a doctor, and he studied herbal medicine with the Choctaw herbal doctor, a shaman, and came back and started practicing medicine, but using the Choctaw herbal treatment, and became extremely successful. Went to Texas in 1835, became the surgeon and doctor for the Republic of Texas Army. Sam Houston and Stephen Austin in early 1836 told him that the war was getting ready to be decided one way or another, and he needed to go home because he had a bunch of children. And if they won, bring his children back to Texas and settle in Texas. So he left right before the Alamo and came back to Columbus. And then after the Texas victory, he and his family moved to Texas. And the whole time he'd been studying ants. And he wrote a paper on the evolution and changes of ants. A guy named Charles Darwin read it, was fascinated because it helped back up his Origin of the Species, and had Linscomb's papers published in England. And then Linscomb started writing hunting stories for the American Antiquarian in the 1870s. If you want to see what life was like back then, and if you like hunting stories, that is a wonderful book. What it is, it's called an autobiography. Linscomb was a prolific writer, and his great-great-great-grandson, Jerry Linscomb, who taught English at Austin College in Texas, tracked down all of his letters and journals and edited them into the book, into a narrative. And so it's actually his words pulled from his writings, but edited into a chronological version. And it's absolutely fascinating. So you get everything from Tuscaloosa to Columbus to Texas and what happened. So again, a wonderful book, out of print now, but sometimes it shows up as a used book. This is one Doug Jones was co-author of on vertebrate fossils of Alabama. And if you like fossils, try to find one. It is a wonderful, fascinating book. And about 12 years ago, I was on a program, I don't know if you've ever heard it, it was Michael Feldman's What Do You Know on Public Radio. And he was asking me about Southern history. And I mentioned I had a manuscript, The History of Steamboats on the Tom Bigby, but I hadn't gotten a publisher yet. A week later, I get a email from a group called the History Press in Charleston, South Carolina, wondering if I was interested in them publishing the book. And I said, I appreciate it, but I'm talking with some university presses. I don't want to do a vanity press where I pay for this stuff. And they emailed back and said, you don't understand, we're not a vanity press. We publish your book. You're paid 7% royalty on sales, and we give you 10 copies, but anything above that you want, you have to buy at wholesale price. And I said, okay. So I published that, and then a few years later, they asked if I could send them my 50 favorite columns. And in magazine articles and newspaper columns, I've written over 600. And so I pulled out my 50 favorite and published it as Columbus Chronicles, Tales from East Mississippi. And I said, no, I want to include Alabama because some of these Alabama stories, and they said, well, we're looking for something on Mississippi to do, so include your stories, but we're going to call it this. So this is still, both this and the Steamboat book are still out there. And so I had fun with it. And probably one of the more enjoyable things in it is in the history of Columbus. When Columbus was founded, they thought it was in Alabama. It was believed that the Tom Bigby River would be the state line. And at first people had settled in Columbus in 1817. In 1819, the Alabama recognized it as the town of Columbus, Alabama. and it was part of Marion County when Tuscaloosa County divided up and split up. The extreme western part of Tuscaloosa County became what's now Monroe and Lowndes counties in Mississippi. The state representative from Marion County was from Columbus, and the sheriff of Marion County was from Columbus. And the county seat initially was at Cotton Gin Point near Amory, but it was soon moved to a place halfway between Cotton Gin Point and Columbus, which is Columbus Air Force Base. So where Columbus Air Force Base is became the county seat of Marion County, Alabama. And you start reading accounts in the fall of 1820 that the preliminary state line is being run, and that it appeared that Mississippi was attempting to steal the best land in Marion County from Alabama. And that's the first inference. Something's going on. And then on January 3rd, 1821, the governor of Mississippi announced that a section of what had been considered Alabama was actually in Mississippi and was being annexed to the state. Interestingly, when Columbus was looking at doing a bicentennial, I'd talked with a former mayor and told him it's not 1821, it's 1819, because we became Columbus, Alabama by legislative act. And I rubbed my eyes when he said, but that's not Mississippi. You can't go back before we were in Mississippi and claim anything. And I said, well, New Orleans and Biloxi go back before there was a U.S. And he said, well, that's different. I just shook my head and walked out. So a lot of interesting stuff, and again found out that the first public school in Mississippi, one of the earliest in the country, was Franklin Academy in Columbus in 1821, and they had a school consultant. And I went in one time and saw the principal and said, I don't see a portrait of your first school consultant anywhere on the wall. She looked at me and said, why would we want a portrait of our first school consultant? I said it was Thomas Jefferson. He was friends with and had grown up with an individual who was president of the Board of Trustees of Franklin Academy, and they were corresponding about the school. One last story, and then I'll stop, and y'all can ask questions if you want to. And if I do that, I'll let you know. One of the might be my favorite story. I called it the Crawford Panic. And I know people who were involved in this or knew about it. Happened in 1924. In the little town of Crawford, which is about 15 miles southwest of Columbus, about halfway between Columbus and Starkville and 10 miles south, they had an alien spacecraft come over. This bullet-shaped thing that they said looked like it was half a mile long, flew over, was not making a sound. It was about 800 feet, completely silent, and gliding through the air. And there were creatures on it who looked like people peering down at them. And they became worried that it was an invasion from Mars. And everybody ran into the houses, and they got white pillowcases and sheets and tablecloths, and ran out and started waving them in the air. And they said it worked because the people from Mars kept going and didn't attack them. I know some people who remembered their parents telling them that story, that they had seen it. Well, I got to digging and poking and found out that in 1924, the U.S. Navy dirigible Shenandoah made the first transcontinental flight by a dirigible. And it crossed over Mississippi, and they had a reporter from the National Geographic on board. And he wrote that the friendliest town that they passed over was this little town in Mississippi, where when they flew over the town, everybody ran in and got flags and things to wave at them, to cheer them as they passed over the town. So I always thought of that as the Crawford Panic. An elderly cousin of mine remembered it. His father was an MIT graduate, and his father had said, "We're going to have a dirigible fly over us tomorrow, and I have computed it's going to come over about 10 o'clock in the morning. And we need to go out in the yard and look so many degrees to the southwest and watch it." And my cousin said, they went out and said his father was only off by about 10 minutes. And here it came right where it said. And he said, it looked like it was 3 or 4 city blocks long, was silver and looked like a bullet and was not making a sound as it passed over. So I thought, well, that explains why people that didn't know what a dirigible was were scared of it. So a fun, yeah.